Well, hello, everyone that's joining us today. Firstly, thank you very much for joining us for this webinar. We've got hopefully a very interesting session for you. So it's a pleasure to have you with us today. And yeah, so today we're going to be talking about how do we unlock and enable large-scale hydrogen production in the UK. So we're going to have a handful of experts giving you some insights from the industry on that, and followed by time for some discussion and some Q&A from you, the viewers. So please do use the Q&A function within this Zoom call to put in your questions at any time during the talks from our experts. And then once everybody's spoken, we'll get to those at the end and hopefully read out your questions. So yeah, please do at any time read out your questions, type in your questions. So yeah, so as I say, we're discussing how do we enable large-scale hydrogen production in the UK. It's been an interesting end of the year. Last year, as we got to the end of 2024, as if you may or may not be aware, so the first three contracts for the HAR1 hydrogen allocation round in the UK have been issued and agreed, which is great progress for the industry. So now we're looking ahead to this year and further ahead of how do we build on that and keep the momentum going, and what's required to continue forward from there. So as I say, hopefully this webinar will provide us some interesting discussions on that. So without further ado, first to speak, we have Robert Garden, who is a partner at CMS. So I'll hand over to him now. And again, please ask any questions that you may have during his talk through the Q&A function.
Thanks, Harry, and good morning, everyone. So as Harry says, I'm Rob Garden. I'm a partner in the planning team at CMS. And I specialise in consenting energy projects and involved in a number of hydrogen projects, both from production through to transportation and storage as well. I'm going to focus on planning today, as I think this still remains a key barrier to delivery of hydrogen projects. And there are three key areas that I'm going to talk through. Firstly, the planning regime itself. Secondly, the policy position. And then thirdly, looking at the role of strategic planning. And as Harry says, a kind of interesting end to 2024. And that was the case with planning and policy as well, with a number of announcements. So first, the kind of planning regime. As part of the hydrogen strategy in 2021, the government stated that one of its aims was to have planning and permitting regimes for hydrogen in place by 2024. Now, clearly it's 2025 and we haven't had those changes. So that's not materialized. So the planning regime hasn't really been designed with hydrogen in mind. That means that different elements of the hydrogen system are subject to different planning regimes across the various administrations and with different planning authorities. So just taking production as an example, that there's no classification of nationally significant infrastructure project at the moment for hydrogen production, unlike pipelines and storage, where you can fall within the DCO regime. So that means the start point for production, whatever scale you're at, is that you're consented through town and country planning, through local planning authority consent. And again, I say that differs to pipelines, where if you meet certain thresholds, so for gas transporters, that's 40 kilometers and certain pressures, you go through the pipeline through the DCO regime. And similarly for storage, if you have certain capacity or certain throughput, you're automatically caught by that DCO regime. So slightly different consenting roles. What we've seen as a result of that, I think at a local level, is consents taking a fair amount of time to go through at town and country planning. And when you look at, for example, the Stanlow hydrogen production facility, that was a project where you were almost 3 years from the point of submission of the application to consent being granted. And that's a fairly common picture now of looking at upwards of a year to get consent. Now, I think the upshot of that for projects is that we're seeing an increase in production seeking what's known as Section 35 directions. So that's effectively a direction to treat the development as nationally significant and take it through the Planning Act 2008 regime. And the benefit of that is that you get Secretary of State consent And it takes the decision away from local planning authorities, albeit they play a key role as a consultee. And we've seen a number of projects do that. Most recently, H2 Northeast has secured a Section 35 direction, and H2 Teesside is currently going through that DCO process. So it's becoming a fairly well-trodden path for hydrogen production. In the electricity sector, the government has announced plans to kind of amend thresholds, so there will be legislation to change thresholds for solar and to introduce onshore wind, but there's been no mention of a threshold for hydrogen production to come into the DCO regime. And ultimately, my view is that's not necessarily a bad thing, because once you hit that NSEC threshold and you have to go through the DCO regime, there's no way out of that regime. And ultimately, the DCO regime is quite timely and quite costly. It can take you up to 4 years from kind of inception to get consent. And whilst the government has introduced a number of changes in 2024 through its NSIP action plan, I don't think that's reduced timescales or the amount of investment that you need to get a project through necessarily. So at the moment, project promoters have a choice. They can stick with the local planning consent, or they can seek this Section 35 direction. And I think for promoters, that's probably the best position to be in. It's also worth noting that I think we have probably a more interventionist government on the planning side than we may have had for the last few years. And certainly projects that meet their core aims like net zero or job creation in the way that hydrogen production may do are potentially more likely to be called in or recovered, which means that even if they're consented at a local level, the Secretary of State may intervene with decision making. Beyond kind of pure planning, you've obviously still got other consenting regimes that you need to negotiate as well. So you've got hazardous substance consents, which often brings in the local planning authority in its role as a hazardous substances authority, something that many local authorities don't often deal with and may not be experienced with. And you've got the environmental permitting regime with the Environment Agency. So still various different consents to get a project off the ground with various different consenting authorities. And I mentioned the Health and Safety Executive there. There are more hazardous substance consents that are going through as production is increasing and the number of projects are increasing. And their role remains critical, I think, in the planning process. And we've seen schemes like Hybont where the HSE have advised against, and you've had planning applications withdrawn. So I think early engagement with the HSE remains important. So the government has confirmed that they're looking at bringing forward a planning and infrastructure bill over the course of this government, effectively to streamline planning for critical infrastructure. And I think hydrogen falls within that, given the various announcements that we've seen. But that's not the quick fix, and it's certainly not going to expedite things as we look towards 2030. So I think where we are with planning regimes is ultimately a position where those permitting hydrogen production can still choose which regime to take a project through, and I think that's really beneficial, actually. Secondly, the second point I want to touch on today is the policy position, and I think this is probably the more critical point for successfully consenting hydrogen projects and for removing barriers from a planning perspective. So whilst we don't have the planning regime in place, the last year has seen a fair amount of movement in terms of policy. In January last year, we had the designation of the Energy National Policy Statements, which replaced those from 2011. And then in December, we had the new National Planning Policy Framework. So starting with the National Planning Policy Framework, that obviously sets effectively the planning regime at a local level, so for town and country planning consents. And there's no mention of hydrogen specifically within that. So in the update that came through in December, no specific mention. But there is general support for renewable and low carbon energy projects. And effectively what the NPPF tells you now is that there's no requirement to demonstrate the need for renewable or low carbon energy, and that local authorities must give significant weight to the benefits attached with those projects. I think my view and the view of quite a lot of others in the industry is the NPPF doesn't go far enough at this stage, both in terms of defining what's renewable and low carbon energy, but also in providing policy support. And I think the government has recognised that in the Clean Action 2030 plan, which came out before Christmas. There's recognition that planning practice guidance, which is effectively the guidance that then sits behind the planning policy framework, will need to go further on renewable and low carbon energy. And again, at present, the planning practice guidance is silent on hydrogen. And so the government's confirmed there'll be updates, and I think anything they can do there to give more guidance at a local level for hydrogen will be really important. I mentioned the national policy statements. And that they effectively apply to those DCO schemes, so to projects that go through the DCO regime, but they are material considerations for projects that go through town and country planning as well. And whilst there's no hydrogen-specific MPS as yet, the government have identified that that might be something that they look at, and I think that's something that would be beneficial for the industry. But in the meantime, the policy EN1, which is the overarching energy policy, does apply, and that is beneficial for the hydrogen sector. It recognises the role hydrogen will play. It identifies and crystallises in planning the kind of 10 gigawatts by 2030 target for production. And it also, and I think quite importantly, identifies that some of the supporting infrastructure, so pipelines and storage, are known as CNP, Critical National Priority, which is effectively a policy designation that allows projects that come forward to override some of the policy tests and issues that might traditionally have led to refusal. And importantly, in relation to transportation and unlocking kind of the industry, there's recognition within the MPS that, and indeed an expectation that promoters should be looking at future demand when sizing and routing their pipeline. So looking to demand, looking to future production, and not basing it on today's levels. So the MPS is definitely a step in the right direction from where we were 12 months ago. And hopefully there'll be further work on a hydrogen MPS, and certainly updates to the MPSs are expected from the government. And then thirdly, kind of wider energy policy and the future, in particular, of strategic planning as part of that. That there's a huge body now of energy policy that supports hydrogen projects. So when you're looking at those benefits tests in the NPPF, a huge range of policy to draw on. Two parts I wanted to touch on today and that came out before Christmas is the Clean Power 2030 Action Plan, which has specific support for hydrogen production, particularly looking at the hydrogen to power model, as well as storage and transportation. And then probably most interesting from a planning perspective is the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan. And that is effectively a plan that is being produced by NESO. So NESO was set up by the government with one of its remits being system operation and looking at planning for the future. And the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan is effectively looking at where hydrogen production may be needed in the future, and setting more of a strategic plan for the first time for both electricity infrastructure, but importantly for hydrogen infrastructure. So not only kind of sets requirements, but I think that the SEP's intended to consider both hydrogen production, hydrogen to power, electrolyzers, transport, storage, and generators, as well as looking at spatially optimizing hydrogen production and power with CCUS, so building on some of that work that's been done with clusters historically. What the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan won't do is kind of direct that development has to be in a certain area, but it will certainly identify where that is likely to come forward based on kind of analysis of supply and demand. And then looking to the future as well, alongside the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan, NESO is consulting on its what's called the Centralized Strategic Network Plan. Now, at the moment, that's focused purely on electricity, but the expectation is that future iterations of that will also cover hydrogen. And I think as the sector kind of develops, it's really important to have this element of strategic planning, and something that historically has been missing from energy planning across the UK. I think one of the reasons it's particularly important and particularly interesting from a planning perspective is that this isn't just a kind of network planning exercise, and it is intended to form part of the planning framework. And all three of the governments, the UK government and also the Scottish and the Welsh administrations, have identified that they expect this to form part of the planning system in the future. Now, the form that takes is unclear, but it's likely that this is going to inform planning policy and ultimately form part of planning policy in the future. In terms of timing, the consultation on that is open at the moment, and that's a consultation on the draft methodology. But the plan from NESO is to have a draft of the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan open for consultation next year, so 2026, with that finally adopted at the back end of 2026, so Q4 for that to come into effect. So really important, I think, for the industry to engage with. So I think just to kind of summarize where we are, the planning regime's still uncertain, but giving flexibility to promoters, which is important. But the key area I think that we'll see change and we'll see further developments, which will be positive for the industry, will be through planning guidance, and hopefully through hydrogen standards that will help local planning authorities, consultees, be able to kind of negotiate the planning system and overcome some of the barriers that are currently there. Harry, I'll hand back to you now. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much for that, Robert. That was very insightful. So we have had a question or two come through, so we'll get to those once we've heard from all our speakers. So yeah, thank you very much, Robert. So moving on now, we have Mark Griffin. So Mark is the head of market development at Scottish Power, and yeah, so he is going to be talking to us today about project development and business development within hydrogen production and infrastructure. So take it away, Mark.
Thanks very much, Harry, and good morning to everybody. Yeah, I'm the head of hydrogen market development for Scottish Power, and my role is to help to find where we can develop projects, either from a regional perspective to service a number of different off-takers and industries, or to work with individual companies that have a scale where sort of a co-located project would work. And touching back on the opening comments, I'm pleased to say that 2 of those 3 projects that signed up with DESNZ pre-Christmas were Scottish Power projects. One is our Whiteley project, which is just to the southwest of Glasgow. And our second project is a joint venture project with Storegga up in Cromarty in the Highlands. So very pleased to actually get those projects signed now and into the delivery phases. And also just to touch on Robert's comments as well around the planning regime, our first project, our Whiteley project, has been in planning for what I will say is sort of forever. It's been a number of years, and there's lots of learnings from that. The importance of that early engagement with key stakeholders, with the public, to really promote the project, to talk about the benefits is absolutely essential. And what I can say on the other projects that we've got in various stages of development, that is getting a lot better. So that's really encouraging for us. We'll bear the scars of being one of the early applications for the Whiteley process for planning. But things are getting a lot better, which is really, really encouraging. And we hope to get that planning announcement imminently, anytime this month, which will be a great step forward as well. But as Harry was saying, I'm here to talk to everybody today in regards to the development of these projects and how we address those markets that are looking to utilise green hydrogen as a decarbonisation fuel. And fundamentally, we see that there's 3 ways in which you can produce and distribute your hydrogen. As per our first 2 projects, the hydrogen production is co-located with onshore wind farms. So we're utilising that behind the meter power to produce low-cost green hydrogen, which will then be filled into high-capacity tube trailers and distributed within the local region to various off-takers. The second option is about using the grid. Use the grid to get your energy to where you need the hydrogen to be used, and you co-locate your hydrogen production with the off-taker or within a cluster close to the off-takers with a short distance distribution model. And then the third utopian model is where you have your off-takers, your hydrogen production and your energy production all in the same production facility, which is a utopian view, which brings all those key things together. So that's really, really important. But what that also means is that when you're looking to develop these projects, that obviously if the answer is you can't get the power yet because of restraints on the grid, there's alternate solutions. If you can't co-locate with the customer, can you locate within a reasonable distance and then distribute that by road haul in the first instance, and then engage around potential for pipeline distribution in the future? So they're absolutely key for us. So that's our first 2 projects. projects. And then it's about understanding the markets, and it's two things. There's a number of things that dictate that as well. It can be around the company's own philosophy or the industry's own philosophy around decarbonisation, and the willingness to want to decarbonize because of shareholders or customer base, or because they're currently large emitters and need to green up their processes as well. And that's really important. And we've seen that in various, we have that across our portfolio at the moment. And in our Scottish projects particularly, we have seen particularly the Scottish whisky industry has really taken a front step for decarbonising and wanting to produce green spirits in the future. And that's been really pleasing, but that's driven by the fact that they believe that consumers in the future will make decisions based on the green footprint and the production methods of that product, but also around the ability to export those products to other markets. So it's around really understanding that, and also that they've been supported by technology development. So they're using the green hydrogen to produce steam as part of the distillation process. And that is a direct replacement for natural gas, but the boiler and the burner developers have got hydrogen-ready systems that can be installed or retrofit to allow them to make that transition to green hydrogen. And with the low carbon hydrogen agreement as well, means that they can do it with minimal uplift in the cost on their incumbent fuels for green hydrogen. So that's really important, and that's been really game changing. But we've also started to see some real momentum. Obviously, particularly in Scotland, we've seen movement around the refineries and other processing like glass and ceramics. The food and beverage industry in general is looking to make these changes and working very hard with the technology enablers to make that happen. And then obviously we have heavy transport. Heavy transport is making some real momentums now. And that's looking at either using hydrogen in its purest form. So that might be hydrogen into fuel cells or combustion engines for HGVs, for trains, small maritime vessels and small aircraft, but also the importance of the hydrogen as an input into derivatives as well. And we've seen some strong movements particularly in the aviation sector around mandates for the use of green fuels. And that's really important. So as part of my role, it's about understanding those markets and making sure that we can be in a position to support those markets as well. Utilising our renewable energy portfolio existing and growing. It's then about understanding how we can utilise that energy to best serve those markets. So I think that's really, really important on that basis. And based on the model that we have, which I'll call a hub and spoke model in those first projects, it also means that we can support off-takers that are on a journey, a transition journey. We appreciate that when adopting new technology, when adopting a new fuel, that businesses can't necessarily go from 0 to 100% decarbonisation in one step. And via a distributed model allows for them to do that at the right pace. And also that in the main part of the subsidy, volume isn't penalised. So we can support small off-takers that are on a transition, either by phasing their fleet replacements or by maybe blending into their industrial systems in the first instance and building up as confidence grows around supply, around technology performance. Is also really, really important. And it's really encouraging, like saying, I think the business model is globally one of the highest value subsidies around. I think that it's the only way that we'll have a chance to decarbonize industry and also attract industry back into the UK as well. As on that, there's a stable and growing source of decarbonised fuel for those processes, so that we can grow UK supply chain as well. So that's a brief overview. Harry, I'm happy to hand back to yourself now and obviously answer any questions as the session goes on. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much for that, Mark. Another very insightful talk. So finally, we have David Eccles, who is the director at Hydrogen Southwest, and he's going to be also speaking about large-scale production and offering some different views on that. And then after David, we'll come around to a discussion and a Q&A. So keep your questions coming in.
Thanks very much, Harry. Good morning, everybody. David Eccles from Hydrogen Southwest. I've just a couple of reflections on what we've heard already. First of all, coming back to Rob's points about the DCO, for my sins, I did the external facing part of the Hinkley Point C project for many, many years. And the DCO process there was incredibly painful, but at least it got us through it. It took a long time. It was incredibly expensive. And 55,000 pages worth of submission to the Planning Inspectorate. But there was a program and a series of guillotines that we moved through and eventually secured consent. So it works, but it's not the panacea, as Rob was saying. And I agree that if we can improve the situation with the guidance given to local authorities and do it in a more distributed way, that would be the way to go. That was my thought really on what Rob was saying. It was very interesting. Also very interesting to hear what Mark was talking about there in terms of potential sectors, and I'm going to come a bit to that. So could we possibly, Maxine, throw up my slide, please? That would be very kind. Next one. This is a Hydrogen Southwest. And our sort of vision and setup on a single slide. Interesting that we're talking, Mark there in particular was talking about the hub and spoke model. And that's what we see happening in the southwest of England. I mean, we're not like Tyne Tees or the Humber, where you're decarbonising heavy industry at scale with large-scale production of hydrogen provided to them. It's going to be much. There is no large-scale heavy industry in the southwest. It's very much going to be a distributed demand and therefore distributed supply. And in that way, we can provide a sort of a counterpoint to those larger projects. And there are some similarities, but also some important differences. The way that we see it going is that developers will identify a particular location, critically where they see potential off-takers, and that will be normally in a range of sectors. And I'll talk about some of a couple of the little projects in a moment. A range of sectors that are going to be end users. So it could be a tar macadam production facility which needs high temperatures, and if you're not going to use natural gas to produce those high temperatures, then hydrogen is an obvious one. It could be glass production we've heard about. It could be road transport, of course. Marine is really important in our part of the world, and I'll come back to marine in a second. And aviation. The Southwest is home to 10 of the 11 biggest aviation and aerospace companies in the world, and we have a very strong sector, aerospace and aviation sector here, and obviously they are looking in a much more strategic and planned way about how hydrogen is going to be involved in the future. So, for example, by 2035, Airbus are absolutely determined that they will have a commercially flying 100, 200-seater, 1,500 nautical miles aircraft flying. And hopefully, it'll be point to point, perhaps Toulouse to Bristol. Wouldn't that be fantastic? But anyway, aviation has got a real vision. They're well organized, and they know when they're going to need their hydrogen and in what timescales, which is helpful when it comes to developers working up the business case. Developers are also going, as well as their end users, developers are going to be concerned about, of course, the access to finance, which doesn't seem to be so much of a problem if you've got the right project. Land, of course, the right piece of real estate, and water, and a suitable source of energy. Because, coming again back to one of the points that Mark made about Nirvana being co-location and end users, I mean, that's how we see this panning out, where you have production probably through renewables, whether it be electrolytic hydrogen or some of the more esoteric and developing technologies around, for example, plasma production or through that channel, and produce the energy locally, produce the hydrogen locally, and then distribute it to your end users locally, whether that be HGVs, coaches, buses, or whatever, or the industrial or commercial or marine applications. So that's how we see it going, a network of hub and spokes that will over time will mesh together to form a proper network across the region. Just to pick out a few examples of what's going on in our part of the world. First of all, Bristol, very interesting, Bristol Port. They've got some real estate there. They're thinking about hydrogen production. They've also got a carbon capture scheme going on there, and taking it from energy from waste plants in the port estate, the port area. Well, if you've got energy from, if you've got CO2 being captured, if you've got hydrogen being produced, then the obvious answer is some sort of synthetic hydrocarbon fuel. And so, actually, EDF, who are Hynamics, the division of EDF that are looking at this, they're much more interested in the industrial applications and new fuels than hydrogen production per se. So hydrogen production will be part of it, but they're very much looking to the new fuels market. So, Bristol Port really can see itself as becoming a future fuel hub, not least because in addition to that hydrogen production for new fuels, they've got a 16-acre piece of real estate owned by the city council that they want to turn into a green energy park, and why not produce hydrogen there? And also High Hall, which is a scheme, a DFT-sponsored scheme that will produce funding for HGVs. I think it's 30 HGVs that will be distributed across a number of companies, and then the hydrogen production and distribution mechanisms to support the operation of those HGVs. They see their anchor site again being in Bristol Port. So you've got the intersection of the M4 and M5 motorways right there next to Bristol Port. You've got rail, you've obviously got maritime sea, and you've got real estate. So Bristol Avonmouth Port is going to be a place for the future, I would suggest. Looking further down to the southwest, we've got Exeter. Exeter is one of the projects entered into the HAR2 round of funding is at Exeter. They're looking for local industrial use. The local council, Devon County Council, has got a super depot for all its vehicles, its gritters and waste lorries and so on being built there. So hydrogen could service those vehicles, and also it's slap bang next to Exeter Airport. So you can see a multiplicity of users, transport users and industrial users in that area. It's a small project, 20 megawatts, and looking to get funding through the HAR2 process whenever that is going to be announced. We've also then got other potentials. I said I'd mention marine. Marine particularly important in the southwest. The opportunities are significant, not perhaps for long over cross oceanic container ships, but certainly inshore fleets. So, for example, there's a massive floating offshore wind project called the Celtic Seas that's coming online. We're talking about 16.5 gigawatts worth of power. I mean, Hinkley is only 3.2. 16.5 gigawatts of Celtic Sea power. Interestingly, one of the projects at the moment is trialing production of hydrogen out at sea. A company called Dolphin are piloting how they produce hydrogen out at sea and pump it ashore. But more interesting, perhaps, is the fact that one of the license conditions for those developing those flow projects is that the vessels that support the platforms must be powered by low energy systems, and hydrogen would be the obvious way of doing it. So you could have up to 200 vessels servicing the floating offshore wind platforms powered by hydrogen. You can see a nice little circular economy there. And finally, I just want to touch on what's happening down in Plymouth. I mean, many of you will know about the Langage project there that was in the HAR1 process for a 10 megawatt plant there. But also the Royal Navy at Devonport are very interested in trialing and piloting hydrogen vessels there. They've also got their own requirements for power at the port, and they've got their own dockside power station. Well, in the future, could that be producing hydrogen? And so there are all sorts of ideas down there. It's very much a think big, start small sort of philosophy, starting small with some piloting of a hydrogen rib next year, and then developing it from there. But then you tie in the fact that Plymouth City Council are also very interested in how they can move forward their net zero agenda. And so there are the synergies with, for example, busing in Plymouth, production of hydrogen that could service those needs as well. So when you've got a big industrial concern, in this case, the Royal Navy's port at Devonport, you've got all sorts of opportunities there, and the civil applications as well. You can see that this thing stacks up, and if not for a massive project on day one, it's a low risk, incremental development of an ecosystem across the region. So I hope that gives people just a flavour for what we're doing in the Southwest, and a bit of a feel for the opportunities in the region where we're scaling things and trying things in an incremental way. Back to you, Harry.
Thank you very much for that, David. Yeah, that's a really good summary of all the great work you've been getting up to in the Southwest. So yeah, that concludes the presentation part of this webinar from our speakers today. So now we've got some time for some questions and discussion. So yeah, we've had some questions come in, so I'll have a look through those and pose those to the panel. So firstly, now we have one this is for you, Robert, around planning. So a question here from Chris Yendel. What is the threshold for hydrogen storage to qualify as a DCO project? Yeah,
thanks, Chris. So the threshold is set out in the Planning Act 2008. So for all sorts of development projects, it's set out there, and it's section 17 of the Planning Act, which sets out the underground gas storage criteria. And I've just got them up on the screen. But effectively, the working capacity of the facility has to be 43 million standard cubic meters, or the maximum flow rate at least 4.5 million standard cubic meters per day. So you can fall into the DCO threshold through either of those capacity limits, and that's for a new project, or if you've got an alteration to a project, an alteration which hits those thresholds will also fall within that criteria. I guess a key thing to say, and most of those on the call may well be familiar with this, but the DCO regime only applies in England and Wales. It doesn't apply in Scotland, so that capacity limit is in England and Wales, and there is a slight difference in the sort of DCO definitions as to how they apply in England and Wales. So for development in Wales, you also have to be a gas transporter to fall within the DCO threshold. I think it's also worth saying that we are starting to see projects coming through. So there's the Aldborough hydrogen storage project over on the East Coast, which is currently going through the DCO process, so meets those criteria. And then up in the HyNet cluster as well, there's the Kuiper gas storage project, which had consent for a natural gas project and tried to seek a non-material change to allow for hydrogen storage. That was refused. So I think the plans for that project will probably be a new DCO. So we are starting to see projects fall within that criteria in the hydrogen sector and use the DCO process.
Thanks, Robert. Yeah, so hopefully that answers your question, Chris. I might actually sneak in my own question here, Robert, while we're still on planning, if that's all right. So you mentioned in your talk about going forward, you want to see more planning guidances and standards at a local level to really unlock the building of infrastructure and projects. I guess for someone who's not super clued up on planning like myself, what kind of guiding principles would you hope to see from those new guidances and standards when we're talking at a local level?
Yeah, I think there's probably a couple of elements. I think the first is just clearer policy support, so identifying the benefits, because often local authorities won't have dealt with a hydrogen scheme, and it'll be the first time they're dealing with it. So not only are they getting their heads around the technology and the different impacts that you might have, but they won't necessarily realise the benefits or be familiar with all of the kind of weight of energy policy. So I think drawing that out more clearly in some kind of planning guidance will be useful. And then I think clearer assessment principles, so things that are often raised by objectors are concerns around land use planning or the safety impacts of a project. So having either clearer industry standards or clearer guidance on planning I think will help in terms of framing the assessment and how local authorities deal with projects as they come forward. So at the moment, I think I have a lot of sympathy for local planning authorities because they're effectively operating in a vacuum where there is insufficient guidance for them on this. And it's for project promoters at the moment to really kind of talk them through and set out in application documents very clearly all of these benefits and all of the impacts and how they should be assessed.
Great, super. Thanks, Robert. So yeah, we'll move on now to another question that we have. So I think this one's probably for we'll start with Mark and then I think we'll come to David. So the question is, when co-locating green hydrogen production with onshore wind, how difficult is it to get water available for hydrogen production, particularly when located away from the coast?
Quite difficult is the answer, and water's becoming more of a challenge in general, and we absolutely for the projects we've got in Scotland, we're fortunate to an extent that we've got some sizable locks in the region that we can access, but still requires a fair distance of pipeline to connect us to those water sources. So that is really important, but we understand that. Obviously, also looking at the potential for borehole water as well, particularly in the Cromarty project. So we're exploring all sources. We go in to these developments when we're exploring water on the basis that it's very unlikely potable water is going to be available. And what I will say is that, and hopefully the same for David as well, is that the water companies, particularly with the ones we're working with, Scottish Water and Anglian Water, is that they're looking at other alternate sources. So a big drive at the moment is effluent water and exploring where they have those large-scale effluent plants, and then what makes it the most viable, whether they clean up on their side and supply for us what would be electrolyzer quality water, or whether we get that raw effluent and then we do the cleanup on the production facility side. So these big changes there. So when you have those meetings, the initial response you get back is no, that water's not available, but there is always a but. And the but is, but what about effluent? As projects get larger as well, there'll be further discussions around desalination, for example, as well, particularly on coastal schemes where we're doing a lot of work down. We've got a development project down in the port of Felixstowe. Felixstowe is a challenging area, lots of potential offtake, but has real challenges around access to power and water. So they're really, really important, but the industry's engaging very much with developers and sees them as a key cog in the decarbonised future, but we need to work collaboratively to get there as well.
Super, thanks for that, Mark. And I guess David, in the southwest, you probably don't have the problem where you're ever too far from the coast, but yeah, what's your take on?
Yeah,
on
I mean, absolutely echo Mark's points there. He said quite difficult. I would say very difficult, unless you've got unless you're accessing the coast. But I also pick up his point on there on grey water. So, for example, Wessex Water, who are one of our members, are running a project at the moment down with Yeo Valley in the centre of the peninsula, producing hydrogen there at a modest and small scale, but using grey water. And they've also got a similar scheme in South Wales going. So, you know, exploratory at this stage, small scale at this stage. But I agree. I think effluent grey water and other sources, rather than possible stuff, might well be the way forward.
Thanks for that, David. And while we're with you, I think we'll stick with you, as there's another question here around community reaction to hydrogen projects. So in the southwest, within the scheme and the program that you're developing, how have you handled the engagement and interaction with the community, and how has that reaction been?
Well, again, I draw my experience with Hinkley Point C, because we did a huge amount of outreach there to the local communities, and really tried to explain and educate in the nicest and correct sense of the word the local communities about the opportunities around nuclear. And we're doing the same with hydrogen, demonstrating the value. And we were pushing at an open door, particularly in the southwest, because people are naturally minded towards green solutions for most things. And therefore, if you explain the benefits, the opportunities around jobs, skills, supply chain development, as well as the green power development aspect of it, you're beginning to win people over. But you need to counter some of the myths. You need to deal with some of the elephants in the room, you know, Hindenburg 1937 and all of these sorts of things, but being open and honest about it, engaging people, and having a structured mechanism by which local communities can engage pays dividends. But it's worth starting early in order to reap the benefits when you come to turning the spade for the first time.
Thanks. Yeah.
I echo that as well, Harry. Don't like you're saying, don't let the first indication the community gets is when you put your planning application in. Google, the internet is a wonderful thing, but it can also cause lots of challenges as well. And what happens if you get that wrong, you end up on the back foot firefighting all the time, and you don't get to tell them about the benefits in a reasonable and a meaningful way as well. I think that's it. It's really important that engagement really early is so important.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for those answers. I think that provides great insight on the importance of being proactive. So we'll move on to a question now around supply chain issues. So this is from Nick Williams from FT Gas Control Systems. So David and Mark, I think you talked a lot about the benefits of co-location and getting your supply and demand close together. and the importance of the demand side. So with the supply chain and actually getting your equipment together and building the projects, where do you envisage the greatest challenge in that side of things coming from? So we'll start with you, Mark, because we're still with you.
Yeah, I'd say that the supply chain is very engaging. It's really encouraging to see a large number of people either already in the hydrogen supply chain or actively exploring how they can play a part. There was an interesting program done by Scottish Government, I think 2 years ago, and that was breaking down an electrolyzer, for example, and looking it down to the core component parts to say, you might create this widget for the industrial gases sector, for other things, but actually this is pretty much the same product. So you have an access, a way to support the industry. In our early projects, we're taking on the principle of a sort of an EPC approach. So we'll contract with someone to do that work, but it's really important. Keep talking to us. We really need to engage. My biggest concern is that with the amount of time it's got to get this momentum going, is that it's around the skilled workforce. It's encouraging the existing and future generations that there's a long-term opportunity here to play a part in this, and that we have the skilled workers to be able to build these products, to install these products. It's and do all the smart design, innovation stuff as well. I think that's the big thing that we have to be really mindful of at the moment with supply chain.
Yeah, I'd absolutely echo that, Mark. Things I would say, one sort of cautionary word is that unless we get hydrogen projects up and running in this country, quickly and soon, then there will be no incentive for the subordinate supply chain to get engaged, and all of the electrolyzers, like the offshore wind platforms, will be coming from Europe and elsewhere. So I think the government is absolutely right in the opportunities that the hydrogen provides for the economy, but they've got to get on with it and stimulate the projects, incentivize the end users, create the demand, stimulate the project's development so that we can build up the supply chain in this country. Otherwise, it will very quickly go abroad, as it is already doing. And I'd also echo your point on skills. Absolutely. We're doing a huge amount of work down here with local colleges and particularly the National Composite Centre that are leading on behalf of the High Value Manufacturing Catapult in identifying the new skills that will be required with the Hydrogen Skills Alliance, and identifying what is going to be required and how those skills may be delivered over time. So people are aware of it, but again, it's a bit like the the grooming gangs. The government, they just got to get on with it and implement the recommendations. Otherwise, the moment will be lost with both skills and supply chain.
Great, thanks for that, David and Mark. So moving on, there's another question that's back in your domain, Robert. So on the DCO, so is there a Scottish variation, and if so, what is it?
Yeah, the short answer is no to this, and I think it does cause some potential consenting challenges in Scotland, particularly where you're co-locating projects. So in Scotland, you've got the Electricity Act applies to kind of generation of electricity, and you've also got the Electricity Act that applies to overhead lines. So for projects that are co-located, you could be left in a situation where you hit the threshold that requires what's known as Section 36 consent under the Electricity Act. So whether it's an onshore wind project, potentially solar in the future, where you're above 50 megawatts, so you have to get consent from the Scottish ministers under Section 36, but that doesn't encompass the hydrogen production facility because that's not a form of electricity generation. So you can effectively be left with what is one project, co-located energy and hydrogen, having to go through different consenting regimes. And I think that's something that we've seen happen. So for hydrogen production at the moment, the regime in Scotland is town and country planning through the local planning authority. And that's certainly kind of how we're seeing projects coming forward. So I know at the back end of last year, Statera submitted their application up in Kintore, and that's going through town and country planning again. What you do have again is the ability for sort of call-in or recovery by ministers. So whilst it goes to the local planning authority, that may not be the way it's always determined, but at the moment, no kind of DCO equivalent for the Scottish regime.
Perfect. That's very clear. Thanks, Robert. So we have another question here around storing hydrogen. So has hydrogen been considered in the UK for seasonal and longer term storage, geological storage? So I can answer this one if I may. So reasonably straightforward answer: yes, it is definitely being considered. There is plans from the government to do a funding round this year that would functionally be fairly similar to the hydrogen allocation round, but specifically for storage. So the hydrogen storage business model. So that is a policy and a funding mechanism that DESNZ are working on currently. So there should be, we expect some progress and updates on that this year. So it definitely is something that's being considered for that longer term and seasonal energy storage, as you say, geological hydrogen storage. And there's some really interesting projects going on in that space. Just off the top of my head, that I can think of MStore, which is an interesting project in the Midlands, which I think has just received some innovation funding, so they'll be exploring that option in the Midlands. So yeah, there's lots of interesting projects being explored and developed, and there is hopefully some more funding impetus this year in exactly that. So the short answer is yes. And finally, I think we've got hopefully got time for this last question that we have from Megan Thomas. So I think this builds on another question we had from, so your answers from Mark and David, when we were talking about getting the community on side and actively engaging with the community and being proactive, what sort of examples of the benefits have you offered and or may consider offering in the future as part of your TCPA hydrogen production facility applications? So and do these differ from any public benefits that you might offer as part of the DCO process? So actually, maybe this is come on to you, Robert, to start.
Yeah, I'm happy to pick that up, and I mean it's something that's kind of quite integral across all projects. So I think the start point is I've not seen a kind of consistent approach to community benefits on hydrogen projects as yet, but I think they are inherently different to some of the projects you see. So electricity transmission is often held up as an example where host authorities don't necessarily benefit. I think for kind of all the reasons that David has discussed, you are potentially looking at a different message with hydrogen because you are supporting decarbonisation of industry in the area. There are a whole other raft of sort of wider benefits that you can draw on in your case. But in terms of sort of pure community benefits, obviously on onshore wind and solar, there's a fairly well-trodden path to how those are offered. And certainly the government is looking at further guidance on onshore wind and solar. But in the Clean Power Action Plan, they have expressly said they are looking at consulting and putting together guidance on how all clean energy delivers community benefit. So I think it's something we'll see further consultation from the government on. Probably in the next year as to how community benefits across all infrastructure can be delivered and delivered more consistently. I think that the final point is just a note of caution that on the planning side, those community benefits kind of sit outside of the planning consideration. So whilst they're offered, they shouldn't really be taken into account in decision making, which is a slight oddity that's always existed, but a couple of projects have fallen foul of historically. And
the last part of that question, are there any differences between the local authorities in terms of what they look for in community benefits for these applications in, for example, Wales versus England?
Yeah, I think there have been, and often it's kind of you have a calculation of payments per megawatt, and I think that's what local authorities probably expect, particularly in Wales, where they're used to hosting more onshore wind historically than we've had in England. So I think there probably are different expectations across authorities.
Okay, super. Well, I guess we're out of time. So that will conclude our discussion and the Q&A and our webinar. So I think lots of interesting thoughts shared, and hopefully we answered a lot of your questions. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining. Hopefully that was insightful, and enjoy the rest of your day, and have a pleasant week.